Let's talk about some rules when we deal with terms. Rule 1. External terms will always display in red text. This is to emphasize that it is indeed a deadline term and we need to take note of it. Also, if the external term is due today or the due date is in the past, then the term will be marked with the color orange. This is to highlight the fact that we have missed a deadline which should be avoided at all cost. Rule 2. An external term is never allowed to be registered on its own. All external terms need to be accompanied by an internal term. The reason is simple. The external term on its own has little impact and only signifies the goal we are working towards. Imagine if we had no internal term on the case and only the deadline. This means that first, we won't know what to do to meet that deadline. Second, the deadline will only appear on a term list once the due date is upon us. We would not have performed any internal actions up to that point, and this will most likely lead to a missed deadline. So the point here is that all external deadlines need to be accompanied by an internal term. Rule 3. You are allowed to have an internal term registered on a case without having to add an external deadline. This obviously only applies if the internal term does not relate to a deadline. So, an internal term does not need an external term to exist. Let's say you want to have a reminder on yourself to send off some documents that's not related to a deadline in any way. You can simply add an internal term without the need to add an external deadline as well. Another good example of this would be a trademark filing. We file when we receive an instruction, but there's no deadline per se that we need to meet. We can simply have an internal term that says prepare filing. Internal terms will usually display in black text, but if the due date is in the past, then the text will change to the color green. This once again indicates that a due date has been missed and we need to attend urgently. So, an external term can never be registered on its own, but an internal term can. Rule 4. You can have multiple internal terms on a case that belong to different workflows. I could have an internal term to check on the progress of an application and another internal term reminding someone in the team to follow up with client on outstanding documentation. All of this is absolutely valid. Rule 5. We can have an external and an internal term group as we've seen before, but we can also have another internal term registered that is unrelated to the deadline. So we could have a renewal workflow, the deadline and the internal term, and then an additional term to check costs before invoicing. So let's take this scenario and check how we can determine which terms belong to which workflows. Here I have a renewal workflow with a deadline and an internal term saying I need to prepare documents. I then have another term on someone else and they first need to check whether this client is a bad payor. How do I know which internal term accompanies the deadline term I see here? Well, first, hopefully you would be familiar with the workflow and you would understand the process well enough to know which terms match. But if this is not the case, there are other ways to distinguish the groups. First, I can check the actual workflow. Right-click on each term and open the workflow. When you do this, compare the workflow name. In my example, I can clearly see that two of the terms belong to the workflow called renewal, and the remaining internal term belongs to a workflow called free text. This way I know which terms belong together, as the second internal term is on a different workflow. There is another easier way to check this. Simply look at the term numbers. These will usually fall within the same range. My deadline renewal terms and my matching internal term falls within the 50,000 number range, but my remaining internal term number is totally different. This indicates that it's two different workflows that we're dealing with. Rule 6. You can have multiple external terms with their internal terms registered on a case. In this example, it might seem like there's a lot going on, but it's what we've been dealing with up to now, just expanded. So let's break it down. First, we have our normal renewal deadline term with the accompanying internal term. Then we have the external use term and the accompanying internal term. We can even take it one step further and add a totally separate internal term, perhaps even two. So to sum up in this video, we've demonstrated good practice when it comes to dealing with terms and the different possibilities available to us.